I want to touch on some things here regarding the intelligence services of the United States and how long were they monitoring Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda uh, in the United States. Now, I'm not going to talk about abroad foreign intelligence services. I just want to concentrate on the CIA, the NSA, and the FBI. Now, if we're to believe the intelligence services, take that with a grain of salt, we're to believe that they didn't have the necessary information to prevent the attacks of September 11, 2001. Well, I don't think that's going to be the case. I think that they had a ton of metadata regarding the CIA and the NSA, and the FBI was left out of the loop. Although the FBI basically did cover up for certain agencies like the Saudis after 9/11 in regards to additional hijackings and the protection of the Saudi royal family, which still goes on today. But the Central Intelligence Agency, who basically gave open-ended testimony to the 9/11 Commission and Joint House Inquiry, didn't tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth in both committees. In February of 1991, the CIA started monitoring bin Laden while he was living in Khartoum, Sudan, when he moved there in the summer of 91. This is the earliest records that we have regarding a domestic intelligence service basically monitoring bin Laden. Now, why would they monitor bin Laden up until this point? Because up until this point, Al Qaeda basically wasn't a group established yet. They were in the middle of getting established, but they weren't an international terrorist organization. All we knew about bin Laden was that he was a young Saudi who came from a powerful bin Laden family background, who was also involved with the family's business called the Saudi bin Laden Group. He was also a graduate of King Fahd Mosque in Saudi Arabia and graduated with an electrical engineering degree. Now, one case officer named Billy Waugh, who was an independent contractor working for the CIA, in which he moved to Khartoum to begin spying on bin Laden. Now, Billy Waugh has a reputation, a very legendary background. He was involved with the capture of a notorious terrorist called Carlos Jackal in Northern Africa a couple of years prior to spying on bin Laden. So that's the reason why they decided to use Billy Waugh to monitor bin Laden. Now, the Associated Press would report that Waugh played like a typecast role as an aging American fitness enthusiast who would regularly jog past bin Laden's home. And he said he would often come face to face with bin Laden and his bodyguards, but that, he would just wave. And the bin Laden and the group in Sudan basically knew that there was Americans, but they didn't know it was the CIA or anything like that, living in Khartoum. But Billy Waugh would later recall that while he was keeping track of bin Laden in the Sudan, that the CIA chief of station in Khartoum told him that one of the targets was a wealthy financier, and that's the reason why they were monitoring him, and that he may be a possible financier and supporter of a group called Al Qaeda. Now, again, this is before the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, which Al Qaeda was not a part of. This is before the bombing of the U.S. embassies in Tanzania and Kenya. This is before the Khobar Tower bombings, 96. This is before the Millennium Bombing Plot, 2000, or the bombing of the USS Cole in 9/11. So why were the CIA basically interested in bin Laden up until this point? Well, bin Laden basically was thrown out of Saudi Arabia because he wanted to use his Mujahideen Arab fighters to fight against the invading Ba'athist army in Iraq. And meanwhile, that intelligence was false. Iraq had no intentions of invading Saudi Arabia. They just wanted to dispel the Kuwaiti government from liquidating the oil fields in which they claimed, Iraq claimed, Kuwait was siphoning by building underground pipes and siphoning oil. That was one of the reasons anyway. Nevertheless, bin Laden basically thought that the Ba'athist army was invading the kingdom. And the kingdom basically, were horrified that this young Saudi bin Laden, who had no military background at all, besides fighting in the front lines every once in a while. And what he was known for was using his father's construction business and building up military huts, building ditches for the fighters along the front lines in Afghanistan near the Paktia province and in Kabul. And what happened was that when they basically said no to bin Laden, they did fear that they would use his group to conduct terrorist operations inside the country. So they house arrested bin Laden and took away his passport and froze his assets. But according to Lawrence Wright, there was a deal made, Peter Bergen, there was a deal made between the Saudi intelligence arm, the General Intelligence Directorate, led by Prince Turki bin Faisal, who met with bin Laden and said that they would unfreeze his assets and give back his passport if he relocated to another country, and that country was Sudan. Now, how did the CIA become involved? Did the Saudis mention bin Laden to the CIA so that they'd begun operations? That's just speculation. We don't know. But it is interesting to know, why would the CIA, as early as 1991, could have been earlier, could have been, we don't know. But right now, what we know by the public record, that as early as 1991, the CIA was monitoring bin Laden in Khartoum when he relocated. Okay. And I'm not going to mention the fact that the CIA, while they were monitoring him in Khartoum, when he left the country and relocated to Afghanistan in 1996, excuse me again, very tired. When he relocated to Afghanistan in 96, they never stopped monitoring him. So they were monitoring in Afghanistan from a distance. Now, what they wanted, the CIA, was basically surround the training camps like Al Farouk, Tanak Farms. What they wanted to do was surround these farms with intelligence posts. Now, they were using the Northern Alliance, which was fighting the Taliban at the time for control of the South. Northern Alliance was at the north, led by Ahmed Shah Massoud. And Shah Massoud was fighting on two fronts. He was fighting Arab fighters, now were coming from Khartoum with al-Qaeda, and the Taliban. The Taliban welcomed al-Qaeda with open arms, and according to Pashtunwali laws, they can't refuse another Muslim from a house of a Muslim. And the Taliban considered the Afghan country their house. Pashtunwali laws predate even Islam. Google Pashtunwali laws to get a better understanding of why later on the Taliban really couldn't throw bin Laden out. Nevertheless, CIA started building listening stations and monitoring posts around the outer fringes of the training camps. Now, according to what I found out from a former detainee in Guantanamo, Mohammed Aoud Slahi, thanks to Richard Cox, that according to Slahi, in an interview with Jordan Peterson, he said that Slahi said that they knew the CIA was in Afghanistan, in some of those camps. That's interesting. I would love to talk to Slahi about this, and I might do it in the future. If that's the case, that means those training camps had intelligence services, intelligence service operators inside the training camps. Now, that would make it that the intelligence services, whether it's the CIA, ISI, Mossad, who knows, MI6, that they could have pertinent information which wasn't shared with anybody else. And what information was that? We'll never know. So the CIA never broke from bin Laden up until this point. Now, that's a lot of data, right? So what happened? Well, in 1995, the FBI opens up a case against bin Laden. Dan Coleman and John LaGuerre, who are members of the New York City's Counterterrorism Task Force, the JTTF, they're sent to the CIA Counterterrorism Station to see what the CIA knew about bin Laden. And according to Dan Coleman, the FBI was basically in the dark about bin Laden. All they knew was that he's a financier and that he's involved with a group called Al Qaeda at this point in Sudan, Khartoum. Okay. They basically didn't know anything. Now, Frank Pellegrino, who's also out of the counterterrorism unit in New York, he was basically chasing Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who really was an unknown to this point. Nobody really knew anything about Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, but Frank Pellegrino knew because he found out that there was a wire transfer from Khalid Sheikh Mohammed in Qatar to a bank account of somebody who was involved with the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, Mohammed Salame. Now, the check was for $600, but he wanted to know who sent this check. So meanwhile, nobody in the FBI in New York knew who Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was, tried to get Pellegrino to ignore that fact, but Pellegrino thought something bigger. That's what made Pellegrino really stood out, because he would be right in the end. So Dan Coleman was in shock when the CIA brought over these thick 40 files thick about bin Laden. That is an enormous amount. Now remember, that's October of 1995. 4 years from 91 to 95. Information. What did they collect? We don't know. It's classified. That the FBI would later find out that the Counterterrorism Center at the CIA had been conducting a vigorous investigation into Wadi al-Hajj. Wadi al-Hajj also had a house in the United States, in Texas, and in, I want to say Arizona. But he also had residence in Khartoum. He was one of bin Laden's personal secretaries and financial keeper records. So Wadi al-Hajj was later arrested when he arrived inside the United States, which the FBI basically visited Wadi al-Hajj in his home in Khartoum and basically took his computers and stuff. And he got spooked and left for the United States, where he was arrested and charged with foreknowledge of the 1998 East Africa bombings. But here we have the FBI basically in the dark about bin Laden, but at least now, 1995, they're starting to get the understanding of who bin Laden was and what he was about. Now, a couple months later, February of 1996, the CIA begins a counterterrorism center of their own, a special center called the Bin Laden Issue Station, or as it was known more commonly as Alex Station. Now, it was codenamed Alex Station because the chief of station, Michael Scheuer, had a son named Alec. And so one of Able Danger's operators, Anthony Schaefer, basically codenamed that for Michael Scheuer. Michael Scheuer would hire known CIA operatives, case officers like Alfreda Ambikowski, Michelle Ann Casey, Jennifer Matthews, and other women. And later on, they would have a nickname called the Manson family because Scheuer had these dedicated group of women that were just a core unit just for him. And the CIA basically found this to be troublesome in the long run and replaced him in 1999 due to his near fervent seclusion of this group, and wasn't cooperative with his superiors like George Tenet, the DCI and CIA. So they basically replaced him, James Pavitt and John McLaughlin. They found Scheuer to be very troublesome. And he was replaced by a more company man, Richard Blee, who headed the Bin Laden Issue Station in 1999. But 1996, here's a dedicated core group that allowed the FBI, the NSA, the DIA, all these agencies to share intelligence with the CIA, but the CIA didn't share intelligence with them. So everyone right off the bat was working and were opposing working with one another because nobody wanted to really work with one another. I mean, the NSA was sometimes sharing with the CIA, but didn't share everything. The CIA did the same thing to the FBI. The NSA did the same thing to the CIA, and the CIA did the same thing to the NSA and the FBI. So it just basically was a mess because some information was shared, but a lot of information wasn't shared, and especially the more important information. Now, I've gone over this ad nauseum about the CIA withholding information about two Al Qaeda operatives, Khalid al-Mihdhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi, from the FBI and the State Department that they were inside the United States and had US visas. Right? Now, in November of 96, the bin Laden received a satellite phone. Now, I have to say that this is the murky. Now, according to the CIA and the FBI, the NSA were monitoring bin Laden's satellite phone in 1992. The NSA says, no, they haven't. Now, depends on who you believe. I happen to think the NSA did, because if the CIA was monitoring bin Laden in 1991, I happen to think that bin Laden, using a satellite phone, was being monitored in Sudan in 1992. Now, because I want to talk about this, is really important, because if the NSA started monitoring bin Laden's satellite phone as early as 1992, that they would have much more metadata. Regardless, according to the public record, we know in 1996 that bin Laden received a satellite phone from Khalid al-Fawaz, who got it from Ziad Khalil, which was an Inmarsat phone. It's not an encrypted phone. So the NSA, the FBI were basically involving in an operation separate of bin Laden, of Ziad Khalil, who is linked to Hamas. So they were following him, monitoring him. They knew that he bought this phone. And so the NSA, the FBI informed the NSA about this satellite phone, told them, hey, could you monitor this phone call, these phone calls? And they did. This phone was tracked to bin Laden in Afghanistan. And because it was an older model of satellite phone that bin Laden was using in 1992, that too was being heard by the NSA. Now, bin Laden's satellite phone was also used by Abu Hafs al-Masri, also known as Mohammed Atef, and Ayman al-Zawahiri, Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri of the Egyptian Islamic Jihad. But these are al-Qaeda emirs. Ayman al-Zawahiri, head of the Shura Council, and Abu Hafs al-Masri, Mohammed Atef, the head of the military committee of al-Qaeda. The calls made on these phones are encrypted, but the NSA is able to intercept and decrypt them because the phone itself is a decrypted device. As one US official in a Newsweek article on February 18, 2002, it's an anonymous official, he said that codes were broken legally. Use that term lightly. And Los Angeles Times will later report that the monitoring these phones produced tens of thousands of transcripts over 2 years. So if we're to believe, because he got rid of it in bin Laden got rid of the satellite phone in 1998. So if there were tens of thousands of transcripts from 1996 to 1998, just imagine how many pages of transcripts we have if it was from 1992 to 1996 or 1992 to 1998. Okay. Now, there were 238 phone calls to Britain, 221 calls to Yemen, and over 130 to Sudan, 100 to Kenya, and Azerbaijan, and Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, United States. Now, the phone calls to Yemen was important because one number kept calling the satellite phone. And this was located in a house in Sana'a, Yemen. Again, I've mentioned this ad nauseum before, so I'm not going to really get into it much, but it belonged to an individual named Ahmed al-Haddam, who was an associate of bin Laden from their days of the Afghan-Soviet War in 1979, 1980. So with the NSA hearing all these phone calls, with the CIA monitoring bin Laden as early as 91, the FBI monitored bin Laden in 1995. You have three agencies, just these three, inside the United States, domestic agencies, collecting data on bin Laden and al-Qaeda. Hardly any of these agencies shared information with one another. And if they did, it was minuscule information. The more important information was kept from each other. So they weren't working together honestly. So what agency knew more than the other? Well, I would submit to you that the NSA would probably know more than the CIA, and the CIA would know more than the FBI. why do I say that? Because the NSA were listening to bin Laden's satellite phone. From that satellite phone, they knew about a house in Yemen. They started listening to the phone calls in Yemen from 1996 to 2001. That's for the public record. Okay. Now, we're to believe the CIA and the FBI. The NSA were monitoring bin Laden's satellite phones from 1992 to 1998. Okay. The CIA were monitoring bin Laden using human intelligence, not signals intelligence. Okay. Where he was going, the operatives that were around him, doing human intelligence from 1991 to, let's just say, before 9/11. The FBI basically were trying to do human intelligence because they don't do much in the way of signals intelligence, but they were being stonewalled by, say, ambassadors of Yemen, Barbara Bodine, in the US's coal bombing, the CIA basically not sharing information with the FBI. And need I even remind you, I don't want to forget, the DI also had a signals intelligence operation, which was codenamed Able Danger, the Defense Intelligence Agency. And I spoke about this ad nauseum. I've interviewed two people that were interviewed with Able Danger, Eric Kleinsmith and Anthony Schaefer, in which they collected data, classified and declassified, about terrorist operatives living inside the United States. So you have four domestic agencies. And the CIA basically told the DI when they were running Able Danger program that the CIA wasn't going to work with them because they considered them a threat. Threat to who? Isn't everybody supposed to be on the same page? So the NSA would be the agency that people need to pressure. Now, the 9/11 Truth Movement, unfortunately, doesn't care about the investigations of these agencies because a good percentage of the 9/11 Truth Movement doesn't believe in hijackers. They don't believe in hijacked planes. So these agencies and these operatives that were involved in it, not sharing information, which allowed for the 9/11 attacks to happen, go ignored by them. They'd rather talk about Ground Zero. They'd rather talk about CGI planes. They'd rather talk about drones, which were being operated by Dov Zakheim, like through an Atari joystick in the basement of his house. Ridiculous, I know. But these are the issues we need to concentrate. What type of data did the NSA collect over those long years? What information did the CIA have pre-9/11? And why did they intentionally withhold information from the Department of Justice? What about the FBI? Why were they not informed about Khalid al-Mihdhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi inside the United States? Who informed the Saudis and Israelis to do operations on al-Qaeda operatives who were later involved with the 9/11 attacks? Did they know about that beforehand? Or were the Saudis and Israelis conducting their own separate operations outside of the knowledge of the NSA, the CIA, the FBI, and the State Department? Did the CIA and NSA involve the Saudis and Israelis? And they got screwed because the Saudis and Israelis didn't share intelligence with the CIA and the NSA? That very well could be true. But none of these answers, now, none of these questions will go answered if we don't ask them in the first place. And that's why I need you to start yelling and asking the right questions.